In 1984, the FBI found something amazing hidden right in front of everyone. A billion-dollar heroin business hiding behind the smell of fresh pizza cheese and pepperoni. This is the story of how Italian-American pizzerias became the front for the biggest drug operation in American history. Welcome to the Pizza Connection. Before we start this amazing true story, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now, if you are getting ready for bed or need a long story to fall asleep to? You are in the right place. Hit that subscribe button to Gangster Nights, the original late-night mob stories. You already know where you heard it first. Drop a like and share this with anyone who loves true crime and mafia stories that are not often told. Picture yourself getting comfortable. This is a trip that will take us from the sunny hills of Sicily to the busy streets of Brooklyn. From secret money rooms behind pizza ovens to the longest court case in American history. This is a story about big dreams, people turning on each other, and the boldness of men who thought they could build an empire on cheese and heroin now. To understand the Pizza Connection, we must first go back in time and across the ocean to Sicily. That triangle island at the bottom of Italy's boot shape. Sicily in the 1950s and 1960s was a place of big differences. Beautiful Mediterranean views covering up deep poverty and hopelessness. The island was badly hurt by World War II. Its buildings were destroyed, its economy was broken, and its people were trying to live after a time of harsh rule and being taken over by other countries in the mountain villages and seaside towns of Sicily. Old ways of life were strong. One of these old ways was the Code of Omerta, the rule of silence and taking care of your own that had controlled Sicilian life for hundreds of years. Inside this way of life, some families had gained power over many years, not through honest work, but through threats, violence, and a complicated web of favors that tied towns together in a net of fear and loyalty. These were the Mafia families, not the fancy Hollywood version, but the real Sicilian Mafia, La Cosa Nostra, a cruel criminal group that controlled whole parts of the island through threats, murder, and bribing officials. In the time after the war, as Italy tried to rebuild, these Mafia families saw a chance. The mess of rebuilding, the flow of American aid money, the weak and bribed government, all of it made perfect conditions for organized crime to grow. The Mafia had always been part of smuggling for centuries. Sicilians had smuggled things across the Mediterranean Sea. Tobacco, alcohol, anything that could make money. But in the 1950s and 1960s, a new and much more valuable product appeared. Heroin, the opium poppy, had been grown in Turkey and the Middle East for thousands of years. After World War II, Turkish farmers grew raw opium in huge amounts. This raw opium would be smuggled to labs in Lebanon and later in Marseille, France, where it would be made into heroin, a process that needed skill and advanced chemistry. The final product, pure white heroin, would then be smuggled into the United States, where addiction was going up and people wanted more and more. This system became known as the French Connection, and it controlled the heroin trade for 20 years. Corsican gangsters in Marseille worked with American Mafia families to fill American cities with heroin. Trade made billions of dollars and caused addiction outbreaks all over the United States. But in 1972, everything changed. The French Connection's end came from a mix of American pressure and French government action. The election of President Richard Nixon brought a new focus on fighting drugs. Nixon declared a war on drugs and made stopping drug trafficking across borders a main goal of American foreign policy. American agents worked with French police to crack down on the Marseille labs. Arrests were made, labs were closed, the supply line was broken for American addicts and the mobsters who gave them drugs. This created a crisis. The supply of heroin almost disappeared. Prices on the street went very high, but where some people saw a crisis, Sicilian Mafia bosses saw a chance. They had contacts with Turkish opium sellers. They had the skill to start their own heroin-making labs. And they had something the French connection did not have: a huge network of Sicilian immigrants in America who could be the perfect cover for a new drug operation. One of the Sicilian Mafia bosses who saw this chance was a man named Badalamenti. Born in Sicily, a small town near Palermo in 1923, Badalamenti moved up in the Mafia through a mix of cruelty and business skill. By the early 1970s, he was one of the most powerful Mafia bosses in Sicily, controlling the group that managed relations between different Mafia families. Badalamenti understood something many old-style Mafia bosses did not. The future of organized crime was not in local threats and protection money, but in selling drugs across borders. The profits from heroin were much bigger than anything the Mafia had ever made from regular crimes. 1 kilogram of heroin bought for a few $1,000s in Turkey or Lebanon could be sold in New York for hundreds of thousands of dollars. The math was simple and very attractive, but Badalamenti also understood the risks. The American government was much more powerful and advanced than the Italian government. American police had resources and technology Italian police could only imagine. To succeed in bringing heroin to America, the operation would need to be carefully organized, split into separate parts, and most of all, hidden behind a fake legal business. This was where the idea of the pizza parlor came in. To understand why pizza parlors became the perfect front for drug trafficking, we need to understand the wave of Sicilian immigration to America that happened in the 1960s and 1970s. This was not the first wave of Italian immigration. Millions of Italians had come to America in the late 1800s and early 1900s, running from poverty and looking for opportunity. But this later wave was different in who came and their background. Many of these new immigrants came from the same small towns in Sicily where the Mafia had power. They came legally with the right papers, sometimes helped by family members who had moved earlier. They settled in Italian-American neighborhoods in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, neighborhoods where Italian was still spoken a lot, where social clubs kept old traditions, where a man from Sicily or Castellammare del Golfo could find others from his hometown. These immigrants started businesses, construction companies, import-export companies, restaurants and pizzerias, dozens and dozens of pizzerias. By the late 1970s, there were thousands of pizzerias in the New York City area. They were everywhere, serving every neighborhood. Open late into the night, they were the perfect legal business for reasons that seemed harmless on the surface. First, pizzerias were cash businesses. In a time before credit cards were used everywhere, most customers paid with cash. This meant a pizzeria's money records could easily be changed. A pizzeria saying it sold $1,000 worth of pizza in a day might really sell $500 worth. But who could prove it? The extra $500 in cash could come from anywhere. And once it was mixed with real money and put in a bank, it was basically clean. Second, pizzerias needed regular deliveries of supplies. Flour, cheese, tomatoes, olive oil. All had to be delivered often, sometimes many times a week. Delivery trucks coming and going from a pizzeria got no attention at all. No one would think twice about a truck backing up to a pizzeria's delivery door. This made pizzerias perfect for getting shipments that had nothing to do with pizza ingredients. Third, pizzerias needed little special skill to run, unlike a fancy restaurant. A basic pizzeria could be run by someone with little training. This meant Mafia soldiers and helpers with no restaurant experience could be put in as fake owners or managers. They did not need to be good at making pizza. They just needed to keep things looking normal. Fourth, pizzerias were neighborhood businesses. They were places where people came not just to eat but to talk with others. A pizzeria owner was a respected person in the community, someone people knew and trusted. This gave perfect cover for men whose real business had nothing to do with serving food. And finally, there were just so many pizzerias that police could not possibly watch them all. Even if the FBI thought some pizzerias were fronts for illegal activity, how could they figure out which ones? They could not investigate thousands of pizza parlors just in case one or two were part of drug trafficking. All of these things made pizzerias the perfect front. But the smart thinking of the Pizza Connection went deeper than just using pizzerias as covers. The group that Badalamenti and his partners built was advanced, split into parts, and worked across the world. The Pizza Connection was not one single group, but rather a network of partly independent cells, each handling different jobs of the operation. The cell structure gave security. If one cell was discovered, the others could keep working. It also gave believable deniability. People in one cell often did not know the full size of the operation. At the top of the group were the Sicilian Mafia bosses. Men like Gaetano Badalamenti, who planned the operation from his bases in Sicily and later from hiding in Spain and Brazil. These men never touched the drugs themselves. They gave orders, set up the money, and collected the profits, always keeping away from the actual smuggling. Below them were the organizers and helpers, men who arranged the shipments, worked between different parts of the network, and handled the planning. These were often mafia helpers who had moved up by showing they were reliable and careful. Then there were the smugglers themselves, people who physically moved the heroin from one place to another. They used different methods, drugs hidden in shipments of legal goods, carried by couriers on passenger planes, smuggled on cargo ships. The routes were complicated and always changing to avoid being caught in America. A network of dealers got the heroin and broke it down for sale on the street. Many of these dealers were connected to traditional American mafia families, especially the Bonanno crime family, which had long ties to Sicilian organized crime. But the Sicilians kept control of bringing the drugs in and selling them in large amounts, taking most of the profits. And finally, there were the pizzeria owners, men who might or might not know the full size of what they were part of. Some were knowing members using their businesses to clean money or hide drugs. Others may have just let their pizzerias be used for meetings or as mail drops, asking no questions about the packages that sometimes arrived or the money that needed to be stored for a short time in the back office. Operations started small in the early 1970s, soon after the French Connection fell apart. First shipments were small, a few kilograms at a time. The heroin would be made in Sicily, where mafia-controlled labs had been set up in faraway places from Sicily. It would be shipped to different stopping points. One common route involved sending the heroin to South America first, often to Brazil or Venezuela. From there, it would be shipped to the United States, either hidden in shipping containers or carried by couriers. This route was made to confuse the police. American agents watching for drugs from Europe might not pay as much attention to shipments from South America. The extra stop also gave a chance to further hide where the drug came from. Another route involved Switzerland. Switzerland's famously secret banking system made it the perfect place for money cleaning. Profits from drug sales in America would be smuggled to Switzerland, where they would be put in numbered accounts. From there, the money could be sent anywhere in the world, with the paper trail so messy that investigators would have trouble following it back to its criminal source. The Swiss Connection served another job too. Payments for heroin shipments could be arranged through Swiss banks, letting the Sicilian suppliers and American dealers settle accounts without large amounts of cash actually crossing borders. A dealer in New York would arrange for money to be put in a Swiss account. The supplier in Sicily would get a message that the money was available. The bank would collect its fees for helping the transaction, asking no questions about where the money came from or the reason for the transfer. By the mid-1970s, the operation was doing very well. The quality of the Sicilian heroin was excellent, often more pure than the French Connection product had been. Prices in America stayed high because demand was much bigger than supply. The profits were amazing. 1 kilogram of heroin that cost $5,000 to make and move could be sold in large amounts in New York for $200,000 or more, after being mixed and packed for street sale. That same kilogram could make $1 million in money, and the money flowed back across the Atlantic Ocean in ever-increasing amounts. To understand the pizza connection fully, we need to understand the men who made it work. These were not the smooth gangsters of Hollywood movies, but rather tough men from poor Sicilian towns. Men who had grown up in a culture where violence was common, and the rule of law was a faraway idea. Gaetano Badalamenti was the mastermind, but he was not the only key player. Born in 1923 in Sicily, a town near Palermo's airport, Badalamenti rose to power in the time after the war through a mix of planned violence and political cleverness. By the 1960s, he controlled much of the drug trafficking in western Sicily and sat on the Mafia Commission that managed relations between families. Badalamenti was known for his intelligence and his anger. He was a man who got respect through fear as much as through admiration. He dressed well, spoke thoughtfully, and showed the image of a successful businessman. But those who went against him disappeared or were found dead in dramatic ways. Badalamenti understood that in the Mafia, reputation was everything. You kept power through the believable threat of violence, even more than through violence itself. But Badalamenti's position in Sicily became shaky in the late 1970s. The Sicilian Mafia was going through a time of brutal fighting inside. Different groups fought for control of the drug trade and for power inside the organization. Badalamenti found himself on the losing side of these fights. In 1978, he was kicked out of the Mafia Commission. His enemies in Sicily wanted him dead. Badalamenti ran first to Spain and later to Brazil. From hiding, he kept planning the pizza connection. If anything, being kicked out of the commission made him more dependent on the American operation and more cruel in protecting it. The heroin profits were his lifeline, the source of money he needed to keep his lifestyle in hiding, and to pay for the security that kept his enemies from finding and killing him in America. The key person was Salvatore Toto Catalano, born in Sicily, Sicily in 1941. Catalano moved to the United States in 1961. He settled in Queens, New York, and went to work in the bakery business. To his neighbors and people he knew, Catalano seemed like a typical Sicilian immigrant. Hardworking, focused on family, quiet. He spoke little English and kept to himself. But Catalano was not what he appeared. He was a man of honor. A full member of the Sicilian Mafia who had been sent to America, specially to help organize the drug trafficking operation. By the late 1970s, Catalano had become the main planner of the pizza connection in America. He watched over the receipt of heroin shipments, arranged for their distribution, collected money, and reported back to the bosses in Sicily. Catalano was helped by a network of other Sicilian immigrants, many of whom were also full members or helpers of mafia families. There was Gaetano Mazzara, who ran a bakery in Queens and handled much of the everyday distribution. There was Giuseppe Pino Ganzi, who worked from a house in New Jersey and served as an important go-between. There were the Salerno brothers, who ran a pizzeria in Queens and used it to clean money and hide drugs. Many of these men had family or hometown connections to the bosses in Sicily. This was not a coincidence. The Mafia had always worked as an extension of family networks and hometown groups. A boss in Sicily would trust a soldier from Sicily in a way he would never trust an outsider. This web of trust based on shared origins and family ties made the organization strong against people getting inside and betrayal. But the Sicilians also needed to work with American Mafia families, especially the Bonanos. The Bonanno family had historical ties to Sicily. Its founder, Giuseppe Joe Bananas Bonanno, had been born in Castellammare del Golfo and kept connections to Sicilian organized crime all through his career. In the 1970s and early 1980s, the Bonanno family was one of New York's 5 main mafia families, and it controlled important areas in Brooklyn and Queens. Relationship between the Sicilians and the Bonanos was complicated. The Bonanos needed the Sicilians' access to Heroin. The Sicilians needed the Bonanos' dealer networks and political connections, but there was also tension. The Sicilians looked down on the American mobsters as soft and ruined by American culture. The Americans disliked the Sicilians as arrogant foreigners trying to take over their area. This tension was managed through a mix of profit, sharing deals, and careful talking. The Sicilians would sell heroin in large amounts to Bonano family dealers at good prices. In return, the Bonanos provided muscle, political protection, and access to American criminal networks. It was a partnership of need, held together by shared greed. By 1980, the Pizza Connection was working through a network of pizzerias and related businesses spread across the New York City area. These places had harmless names and seemed completely legal, but behind the scenes, they served as centers for one of the largest criminal businesses in American history. One of the most important places was the Rama restaurant in East Rutherford, New Jersey. The Rama was not actually a pizzeria, but an Italian restaurant, but it served the same job. Its owner, Giuseppe Pino Ganci, was one of Catalano's most trusted helpers. The Rama's location, off a highway in suburban New Jersey, made it perfect for meetings. Men from different parts of the operation could meet there without causing suspicion. They were just friends meeting for a meal, but the Rama was more than a meeting place. In a back room, open only to those who knew to ask, was a counting room. Here, money from drug sales would be brought in shopping bags and suitcases. Counters would work through the night, sorting bills by how much they were worth, bundling them with rubber bands, getting them ready to be moved to Switzerland or put into legal businesses. The amount of money was amazing. On a busy week, the Rama's counting room might handle $1 million or more. The bills were small amounts, 5s, 10s, 20s. The money of street drug sales, counting and getting this money ready to be put in the bank, needed many hours of boring work. But it was necessary work. The money had to be cleaned, changed from bulky cash into wire transfers and bank checks that could move through the legal money system in Queens. The Pronto Demolition Company served as another center, despite its name. Pronto Demolition did little real demolition work. Instead, it served as a headquarters for Salvatore Catalano and his helpers. The company's trucks and equipment gave cover for moving drugs and money. A demolition company truck driving through Queens at strange hours would get no attention. Who could say what was in the back? Construction garbage, equipment. In fact, it might be 100 kilograms of heroin or suitcases filled with cash. The Al Dente Pizzeria in Brooklyn was another key place. Al Dente was a working pizzeria that really served customers, but it was owned and run by mafia helpers. The pizzeria's back room served as a hiding house where heroin would be hidden after it arrived from overseas. The drugs would be stored there for a short time, sometimes for just a few hours before being moved to dealers. The constant activity of a busy pizzeria. Delivery trucks coming and going, employees arriving for shifts, gave perfect cover for these transfers. There were many other places. A bakery here, a catering company there, a small restaurant in the Bronx. Each served a special purpose in the network. Some were mainly for money cleaning, others were for storage. Still others were for meetings or just as legal businesses where mafia helpers could be employed, giving them seeming legal income on tax papers that would satisfy any quick investigation. The beauty of the system was its backups and flexibility. If one place became too dangerous, if there were signs that police were watching, the operation could simply move to other places. Heroin could be stored at a different pizzeria. Meetings could be held at a different restaurant. Money could be counted at a different place. The network was strong, able to change under pressure without closing completely. But this strength also created weaknesses. The more places involved, the more people who knew at least part of what was happening. The more people involved, the bigger the risk that someone would make a mistake or worse, decide to work with the police. The Pizza Connection's strength. Its spread-out network structure was also a possible weakness by 1980. Hundreds of people were involved in the operation in different ways. Most knew only their small part of the puzzle. A pizzeria owner might know that he sometimes needed to store packages and not ask questions. A delivery driver might know that sometimes he transported more than pizza ingredients. A counter at the Rama might know he was handling drug money, but have no idea where the heroin came from or how it entered the country. This splitting into parts was on purpose and necessary for security. But it also meant the organization depended on a complicated web of relationships and communications. Orders had to flow from the top to the bottom. Money and information had to flow back up. Coordinating all of this needed constant communication. Phone calls, meetings, messages passed through go-betweens. And this communication, it would turn out, would be the organization's downfall and before going forward. Remember, only one channel tells it like this. Every single night, and that is Gangster nights. The rest are just copies. By 1980, the Pizza Connection was working at full power, moving hundreds of kilograms of heroin into the United States every year. The size of the operation was amazing. Careful guesses suggest between 1975 and 1984, the group smuggled over $1.6 billion worth of heroin into America. In today's dollars, changed for inflation, that would be well over $5 billion worth of drugs. To understand how such huge amounts of heroin could be moved without being caught, we need to look at the international network that made it possible. This network reached across 4 continents and involved dozens of people in very special jobs. The process started in the Middle East and South Asia, where opium was grown. Turkey had usually been a main source, but by the late 1970s, opium was also coming from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Southeast Asia. The raw opium would be bought by middlemen who specialized in this trade. Often ethnic Turks or Kurds with connections to both the farmers who grew the poppies and the criminal groups that made and sent out the final product. Raw opium would then be moved to refineries. In the case of the Pizza Connection, many of these refineries were in Sicily itself. The Sicilian Mafia had set up advanced heroin laboratories in faraway mountain places, far from big cities where police were stronger. These labs had the chemicals and equipment needed to change raw opium into heroin. A complicated process needing skill in chemistry, the making process involved many steps. First, the raw opium had to be changed into morphine base through a chemical process involving lime and ammonium chloride. This morphine base would then be made into heroin through a process involving acetic anhydride, a chemical that was supposedly controlled but could be gotten through different ways. The final product, if properly made, was a white or off-white powder that was 80 to 90% pure heroin. This high-quality heroin was much more valuable than the brown heroin that came from less advanced labs. The purer the heroin, the more it could be mixed before sale on the street, and so the more profit it made. The Sicilian lab's reputation for making high-quality product made their heroin very wanted by American dealers once made. The heroin had to be smuggled to the United States. This was perhaps the most dangerous part of the operation, the point at which the drugs were most open to being stopped. If a shipment was taken, not only was the product lost, but there was also the risk that the taking could lead investigators back along the supply line to make this risk as small as possible. The Pizza Connection used many smuggling routes and methods, always changing their way to avoid patterns that police might notice. One common method was to hide heroin in legal cargo shipments. A container loaded with, say, Italian ceramic tiles might have a false bottom or false sides where heroin could be hidden. The container would be shipped to a legal import company in the United States, perhaps one controlled by the organization, or perhaps one that had been gotten into or bribed. When the container arrived at an American port, it would be processed through customs like any other cargo. Customs inspectors could not possibly check every container in detail. The amount of international trade was simply too large. They relied on random checks, risk guessing, and tip-offs to decide which shipments to check closely as long as the papers were in order and there were no warning signs. A container would likely pass through without detailed inspection. Once in the United States, the container would be delivered to a warehouse. There, members of the organization would unload it, get the hidden heroin, and send the legal cargo on to its supposed destination. The heroin would then be moved to safe houses and distribution points. Often the pizzerias that gave the operation its name. Another method involved human couriers. People would fly from Europe to the United States, carrying heroin hidden in specially made clothes, in luggage with false bottoms, or even inside their bodies, swallowed in condoms or balloons, an extremely dangerous method that could be deadly if a packet broke. These couriers were usually low-level, helpers or people desperate for money who were willing to take huge risks for relatively small payment. The good thing about using couriers was that heroin could be moved in small amounts that were easier to hide and less terrible if taken. The bad thing was that each courier was a possible weak link, someone who might be caught and decide to work with the police to make this risk as small as possible. Couriers were told as little as possible about the organization. They would be given their heroin, their ticket, and instructions on where to deliver the drugs. They would not know who gave them the drugs or who would get them on the other end. They would simply be told to check into a certain hotel and wait for contact. A third route, especially important to the pizza connection, went through South America. Heroin would be shipped from Sicily to Brazil or Venezuela, where it would be held for a short time before being shipped to the United States. This routing served many jobs. It broke the direct connection between Sicily and America, making it harder for investigators to follow the drugs back to their source. It also took advantage of the fact that American customs was less focused on South American imports when looking for heroin, which was more often connected with Europe and Asia. South America. The organization kept relationships with local criminals and bribed officials who could help the moving of drugs. Brazil, especially with its large Italian immigrant population and historical ties to Sicily, proved to be a useful stopping point. Gaetano Badalamenti himself spent time in Brazil, planning operations from his hiding place. If moving heroin was the heart of the operation, moving money was its lifeblood. The huge profits made by drug sales created an enormous planning problem. How to change hundreds of millions of dollars in small amount cash into usable things without getting police attention. This is where Switzerland came in. Swiss banking secrecy laws, which went back to 1934, made it almost impossible for foreign investigators to get information about Swiss bank accounts. A numbered account in Switzerland was for all practical purposes secret. Even Swiss authorities would not give out account information, except in the most extreme cases, and certainly not to foreign police forces investigating non-violent crimes for the pizza connection. Swiss banks were a perfect tool for money cleaning. The process worked like this. Cash from drug sales in America would be collected and got ready to be moved. This was work that needed many people. Millions of dollars in small bills had to be counted, sorted, and packaged. The counting rooms at places like the Rama restaurant would work all day and night during busy times. Once ready, the money had to be physically moved to Switzerland. This was done by couriers who would carry the cash in suitcases traveling on passenger planes to Zurich or Geneva. These couriers would say they were carrying cash if asked. There was nothing illegal about traveling with cash as long as you said you had amounts over $10,000. They would claim to be businessmen or to be carrying money for legal business reasons in Switzerland. The couriers would go to banks that had been picked as willing to ask few questions. Despite Switzerland's reputation for strict banking rules, there were banks and bankers who would accept large cash deposits with little paperwork, especially if the person putting money in was willing to accept less good terms or pay higher fees. The banks benefited a lot from these deposits, collecting fees and being able to use the put-in money for investment once deposited. The money could be moved electronically anywhere in the world. Wire transfers would move millions from Swiss accounts to accounts in Sicily, to fake companies in Panama, to real estate investments in Spain. The money was now in the legal money system, mixed with legal funds. Its criminal origin hidden by layers of transactions and company structures. Pizza Connection used several key money helpers in this process. These were specialists in money, cleaning who understood international banking and could set up transactions to avoid being noticed. Some were dishonest bankers who bent or broke the rules for a cut of the action. Others were legal money professionals who may not have known the true source of the funds they were handling, or who chose not to ask questions. One key person was Franco Della Torre, a Swiss-based money consultant who helped the organization move money and set up company structures. Della Torre understood the details of Swiss banking law and knew which banks and bankers could be approached. He would set up fake companies and trusts that could hold things, making it difficult for investigators to find out the true real owner. Another important helper was Oliviero Tognoli, a money dealer who worked in Switzerland and Italy. Tognoli's business gave perfect cover for large-scale money movement. Money dealers legally moved large amounts of cash as part of their business. A dealer might exchange dollars for francs or lira, in amounts that would be suspicious coming from a person, but were normal for a money business. Tognoli used his business to clean drug money, mixing it with legal transactions. The Swiss connection was so important to the operation that members of the organization made many trips to Switzerland. Salvatore Catalano traveled there many times, as did other key people. Phone calls between the United States, Sicily, and Switzerland were constant, coordinating shipments, payments, and account transfers. But this international activity also created weaknesses. Every phone call was possibly able to be listened to. Every international money transfer left a paper trail, however hidden. Every trip abroad was written down in passport stamps and airline records. The very complexity that made the money cleaning operation successful also created chances for investigators if they could put together the puzzle for the men actually running the Pizza Connection day to day. Life was a strange mix of the ordinary and the dangerous. They lived double lives, outwardly respectable businessmen and family men, secretly criminal masterminds handling drugs and money on a huge scale. Salvatore Catalano was the perfect example. To his neighbors in Queens, Catalano was a quiet, hard-working immigrant who owned a bakery. He kept his lawn neat. He went to church sometimes. He drove a normal car. He did not show off wealth or get attention for himself. He seemed in every way like thousands of other Sicilian immigrants, trying to make a life in America. But Catalano's real life was very different most days. He would leave his home early and drive to Pronto Demolition or to one of the pizzerias in the network. There he would meet with other members of the organization, getting reports, giving instructions, solving problems. He would take phone calls from Sicily, speaking in careful code about shirts, kilograms of heroin, and shoes. Money. He would watch over the receipt of heroin shipments and arrange for their distribution to street-level dealers. The work needed constant attention and problem solving. A shipment might be late. A dealer might come up short on payment. A pizzeria owner might get nervous and need calming. The police might raid a place. Needing quick action to move drugs and money to safer places, every day brought new challenges, new risks, and always there was the need for secrecy. Members of the organization were trained in anti-watching techniques. They would change their routes, watch for anyone following them, use pay phones rather than home phones for sensitive calls. They would meet in public places where they could see anyone coming, parks, restaurants, parking lots. They spoke in code and avoided putting anything incriminating in writing, but keeping operational security. While coordinating such a complicated operation was very difficult, the organization needed to communicate constantly. But every communication was a possible weakness. They tried to use code, but code could be broken. They tried to limit phone conversations, but sometimes there was no choice. They tried to keep meetings secret, but meetings could be watched. The counting rooms, where cash was handled, worked like assembly lines. Workers, often women, who were thought to be less likely to get police attention, would sit at tables piled with money. They would sort bills by how much they were worth, count out specific amounts, and bundle them with rubber bands or in bank wrappers. It was boring, repeating work, but it needed honesty. The wrong person in a counting room could steal huge amounts, and the organization needed to trust that the people doing this work would not take more than was allowed. The amounts of money were truly hard to understand. $1 million in $20 bills weighs about 55 pounds and takes up roughly the same space as a case of wine during the busiest times. The organization was handling millions of dollars per week. The physical planning of handling that much cash, counting it, moving it, storing it, was big. Security was a constant worry. With so much money flowing through the operation, there was always the risk of robbery, either by outsiders who might learn of the money's existence, or by insiders who might decide to take what they could and disappear. Violence was used on purpose to discourage such thoughts. When someone stole from the organization or betrayed it, the response was quick and brutal. Bodies turned up in car trunks or were never found at all. The message was clear. Stealing was not worth it, but violence also created problems. Every murder was a crime that police would investigate. Every body was physical proof. The more violence the organization used, the more attention it got. This created a delicate balance. Enough violence to keep discipline and respect, but not so much that it brought unwanted looking. The relationship between the Sicilian traffickers and the American Mafia added another layer of complexity. The Bonanos and other New York families wanted a piece of the action, but the Sicilians were reluctant to share more than necessary. Talks over area rights and profit splits were ongoing and sometimes tense. The Bonanno family's leaders during this time included men like Philip Rustelli, who was officially boss but spent much of this time in prison, and Dominic Sonny Black Napolitano, a powerful capo. These men saw that the Sicilian heroin operation was making huge profits, and they wanted the Bonannos to get a bigger share, but the Sicilians held the upper hand. They controlled the supply of heroin, and they had their own organizational structure that was separate from the American families. The Sicilians were not full members of the Bonanno family. They were members of Sicilian families which they saw as more real and powerful. They would work with the Bonannos when it served their purposes, but they would not put themselves under them. This tension sometimes flared into conflict. There were fights over area, over money, over respect, but for the most part, the mutual benefits of working together kept the peace. The Sicilians got access to American dealer networks and political protection. The Bonannos got access to high-quality heroin at good wholesale prices, as long as everyone was making money. The partnership held together. One of the most interesting parts of the pizza connection was the fancy code language the organization made up to communicate about illegal activities while avoiding clear criminal talk. This code was needed because the members suspected, correctly as it turned out, that their phones might be tapped and their conversations listened to. The code was based on replacing ordinary words for criminal terms. Shirts meant kilograms of heroin. A conversation about needing 22 shirts meant someone was ordering 22 kilograms of heroin. Shoes meant money, perhaps because you needed to walk money to the bank or to Switzerland. A suit sometimes meant a complete transaction. Heroin for money places were often called by code as well, or by purposely vague descriptions. The place near the bridge might mean a specific pizzeria. Where we met last time would be understood by both people, but meaningless to anyone listening to the call. Phone numbers were sometimes hidden by adding or taking away. A digit with both people understanding the system. People were called by nicknames or by coded names. A particular supplier might always be called the old man or our friend from the city. An investigator listening to these conversations would have no idea who was being discussed. Even amounts and prices were sometimes hidden. Instead of saying $200,000, someone might say 200 pieces, or the usual amount times 2. Numbers might be made bigger or smaller by a steady factor that both people understood. The code was not perfect. No code is, with enough context, patterns began to appear. If someone frequently talked about shirts, and these conversations were always followed by money transfers or meetings, investigators could reasonably guess what shirts really meant. But the code served its job of creating believable deniability. A defense lawyer could argue that shirts really meant shirts, that his client ran a clothing business on the side. The organization also used payphones whenever possible for sensitive conversations. Payphones could not be easily tapped in advance. An investigator would have to know which specific payphone would be used and arrange for listening, which was difficult and needed many resources. Members would call from different payphones each time, making patterns hard to set up when they did use their home or business phones. Conversations were kept short and vague. "Call me back from outside" was a common phrase, meaning "this is sensitive, use a payphone." The person on the other end would hang up, go to a payphone and call back to continue the conversation. Despite these precautions, the sheer amount of communication needed to run such a large operation meant that eventually patterns would appear. And federal investigators were watching, listening, and slowly beginning to understand what they were hearing. The FBI's path to finding the pizza connection began not with brilliant thinking, but with luck and not giving up. In the late 1970s, police agencies across the United States were struggling with an outbreak of heroin trafficking. The drug was flowing into American cities in amounts that seemed impossible given the supposed breaking of the French Connection. Where was all this heroin coming from? Different investigations produced pieces of information. The Drug Enforcement Administration noticed that heroin seizures more and more involved suspects with Sicilian last names and connections to Italian-American neighborhoods in New York and New Jersey. The quality of the taken heroin was remarkably high and steady, suggesting an advanced supply line, but these were just separate data points. No one had yet seen the big picture. The breakthrough began in 1979 with an investigation that at first had nothing to do with the pizza connection. DEA agents were investigating a suspected heroin dealer in the Midwest when they followed some of his supply back to New York. Watching the New York connection led them to a pizzeria in Queens. Watching the pizzeria, agents noticed something odd. Men would visit for very short times, staying only minutes, leaving without food. The pattern suggested the pizzeria was being used as a meeting place or message drop. The DEA shared this information with the FBI's New York field office, which had a unit focused on investigating organized crime. One of the agents in this unit was Carmine Russo, an agent with Italian-American background who understood the culture and importantly spoke Italian. Russo looked at the watching reports and the names of the people involved, and something clicked. These were Sicilians, not Italian-Americans from families that had been in America for generations. Sicilians, more than that, with reported ties to organized crime in Sicily. Russo began pulling threads. He asked for information from the FBI's legal helpers in Italy and from Italian police. What came back was interesting and disturbing. Many of the men involved in the Queens pizzeria were not just Sicilian immigrants, but suspected mafia members in Sicily who had moved to America. Some had arrest records in Italy for serious crimes. Some were subjects of ongoing Italian investigations. This suggested something important, not just ordinary drug dealing, but an organized international operation. Russo and his co-workers began putting together what they knew. They identified Salvatore Catalano as a person of interest. They learned about Pronto Demolition and the bakery Catalano owned. They began watching, but watching alone was not enough. Watching people enter and leave buildings told you they were meeting, but not what they were discussing. Following people told you where they went, but not what they were doing there to build a case that could be used in court. The FBI needed to understand the operation from the inside. They needed to hear what was being said. They needed wiretaps. Getting okay for a wiretap was not simple. Federal law required that investigators first show that other investigative methods had been tried and failed or would be too dangerous. They needed to show probable cause that specific crimes were being committed and that the wiretaps would produce proof of those crimes. They needed a judge to sign off on the request in early 1980. The FBI put together its case for wiretaps. They presented proof of suspected drug trafficking, the suspicious meetings, the connections to known criminals, the patterns of behavior matching organized crime. A federal judge looked at the application and gave permission to tap several phones, business phones at Pronto Demolition and the bakery, and some home phones of suspected members. Putting in the wiretaps was a technical challenge for some phones. The FBI could work with the phone company to intercept calls at a central switching station. For others, they needed physical access to the place to put in recording equipment. This sometimes meant breaking into businesses after hours. Legal when done with a warrant, but risky. If the targets found the break-in, they would know they were under investigation and would change their behavior once the wiretaps were put in. The FBI began recording, and what they recorded was both revealing and frustrating. The calls were almost entirely in Sicilian dialect, a version of Italian that was different from standard Italian. Finding translators who could understand Sicilian dialect and also figure out the code language being used was very difficult. FBI eventually got several Italian-speaking translators, including some who were themselves Sicilian Americans and could understand the dialect. These translators would listen to recordings and prepare summaries. Slowly, a picture began to appear. The conversations were about drug shipments, money transfers, and coordination of criminal activity. The code language became clearer with repeating when someone talked about shirts. They meant heroin, but the investigation revealed how huge the operation was. The wiretaps picked up calls to and from places across the United States and internationally: Sicily, Switzerland, Brazil, Spain. The organization was far bigger than the FBI had first thought. This was not a local drug ring, but an international trafficking network working on a huge scale as the investigation went forward. The FBI got okay for more wiretaps by 1982. They were listening to more than 20 different phone lines connected to the organization. The amount of recorded material was amazing. Thousands of hours of conversations. Translating and studying all of this material needed a special team working all day and night. Investigation was given a name: Operation Caesar. It would become one of the largest and most complicated organized crime investigations in FBI history, involving hundreds of agents and support people, but even with huge resources. The investigation faced big challenges. One of the biggest challenges was the international nature of the operation. Proof of crimes committed in the United States might involve calls to Sicily or money transferred through Switzerland. To successfully take to court, investigators needed to understand and write down the whole supply line from opium poppy to American street corner. This needed working together with foreign police agencies, which was easier said than done. Different countries had different laws about privacy, wiretaps, and proof collection. What was legal procedure in the United States might not be allowed in Italy, and the other way around. More than that, some countries were simply unwilling to work together fully, whether because of legal limits, political thoughts, or dishonesty. The FBI worked through official ways, asking for help from the Italian state police and the Swiss authorities. The Italians were generally willing to work together. They had their own interest in fighting the Sicilian Mafia, but the Swiss were more difficult. Swiss banking secrecy laws made it nearly impossible to get information about money transactions. Even when Swiss authorities were willing to help, the process was slow and bureaucratic little by little. However, international working together got better. Italian judges who were themselves fighting the mafia shared information with their American partners. Some of this information was extraordinary. Recordings of mafia meetings in Sicily, money papers taken in Italian raids, statements from Italian informants who had turned against the mafia. The Italians were in the middle of their own anti-mafia campaign, the Maxi trial, and they saw that the Pizza Connection investigation was related to their efforts. The working together extended to coordinated operations. When the FBI learned that a key person would be traveling to Italy, they would tell Italian authorities who would do watching on their end when a heroin shipment was being arranged. Both American and Italian investigators would watch the preparation and moving this level of international police working together was new at the time and would set a model for future investigations across borders. As more wiretap recordings piled up, FBI analysts worked to break the organization's code language more completely. This needed not just translation, but also context and information analysis. They made charts mapping relationships between people, tracking who called whom and how often. They connected phone calls with scene meetings and money transfers. One breakthrough came when investigators found the purpose of calls to specific Swiss phone numbers. By connecting the timing of these calls with later wire transfers and cash movements, they realized these numbers belonged to money helpers and banks. The Swiss authorities were eventually persuaded to confirm which institutions were connected to the phone numbers, though getting detailed account information remained difficult. Another breakthrough involved tracking physical watching with phone intercepts. Agents following Salvatore Catalano saw him meeting with a specific person in a parking lot shortly before the meeting. Both had made calls to the same phone number in Sicily shortly after. Both made calls to numbers in Switzerland. The guess was clear. They had met to discuss a transaction, called Sicily for OK, and then called Switzerland to arrange payment. This pattern repeated enough times that it became written down procedure. The FBI also benefited from lucky breaks in one case. A low-level courier was arrested at an airport with heroin under questioning. He gave information about where he had received the drugs and where he was supposed to deliver them. This led to watching of a new place that had not previously been on the FBI's radar in another case. A money counter became unhappy and gave information to local police, which eventually made its way to the FBI. But perhaps the most important break came from the sheer amount of recorded conversations. With thousands of hours of wiretaps, patterns appeared. Certain phrases were used regularly in certain situations. Certain people were always involved in certain types of conversations. The organization's working structure became clear. Who gave orders, who followed them, how money flowed, how drugs moved. By 1983, the FBI had collected a huge amount of proof. They understood the Pizza Connection structure and could name dozens of key members. They had proof of drug trafficking, money cleaning, and racketeering, but they faced a difficult decision: when to move in for arrests. Arresting too soon would mean missing some members who had not yet been named. It might also mean having not enough proof to convict on the most serious charges. But waiting too long increased the risk that the investigation would be discovered and the organization would scatter. There was also the moral part. Every day the organization kept working. More heroin reached American streets and more lives were ruined by addiction. By early 1984, federal lawyers and FBI leaders decided the time had come. They would do a huge coordinated takedown of the whole operation. The planning of this operation was amazing. Arrests would need to be at the same time across many states to prevent anyone from running. When they heard that others had been arrested, search warrants would need to be done at dozens of places. Proof would need to be secured and listed. The FBI put together arrest teams for each target. They planned the timing carefully. Early morning when targets would likely be at home before they had scattered for the day's activities. They worked with state and local police who would help with some arrests and secure areas. Lawyers prepared a huge charging document. The charges would include conspiracy to distribute heroin, conspiracy to clean money, and racketeering under the RICO law. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO was a powerful tool that allowed lawyers to charge the whole organization as a criminal business and hold leaders responsible for crimes committed by helpers in furtherance of the business. The charging document named 31 defendants, at first with more to be added as the investigation continued. Among them were Salvatore Catalano, Gaetano Mazzara, Giuseppe Pino Ganci, and other key people in the American operation. Also named were suppliers in Sicily and money helpers in Switzerland. Though getting these defendants sent to the U.S. would prove challenging. Notably, missing from the first charging document was Gaetano Badalamenti. The FBI knew he was involved. Wiretaps and information made that clear. But he was in Brazil beyond easy reach. The plan was to build a case and then work through diplomatic ways to secure his arrest and sending to the U.S. This would take time and careful diplomatic work, as Brazil was notoriously reluctant to send its residents to other countries as the arrest date came near. Tensions ran high. Months and years of work were about to reach their peak. If the operation went wrong, if targets ran, if proof was destroyed, if violence happened, the whole investigation could fail. The FBI looked at their plans again and again, checking every detail, making sure every team knew their job. And on the morning of April 9th, 1984, they moved. The morning of April 9th, 1984, began like any other for Salvatore Catalano. He woke early, as was his habit, and got ready for another day of running the operations of the Pizza Connection. He had no reason to think this day would be different from any other. He had no idea that dozens of FBI agents were at that moment moving into position around his home in Queens at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning. FBI agents knocked on Catalano's door. When he answered, they said who they were and placed him under arrest. Catalano said nothing. He knew better than to speak to police without a lawyer present. He was handcuffed and led to a waiting car while other agents entered his home to do a search warrant. Similar scenes played out across New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and other states. Giuseppe Pino Ganci was arrested at his home near the Rama restaurant. Gaetano Mazzara was taken into custody at his bakery in Queens. The Salerno brothers were arrested one by one. The key people in the American operation were rounded up. The arrests went smoothly with no violence and no escapes. The FBI's careful planning paid off. By moving at the same time at dawn, they prevented anyone from warning others. A few suspects were not at home and at first avoided arrest, but they were located and arrested within days. The organization's American leadership was effectively taken out in a matter of hours as arrests were being made. Other FBI teams were doing search warrants at the various businesses connected to the operation. At Pronto Demolition, agents found files and records that wrote down transactions. At several pizzerias, they found cash hidden in back rooms and walls. At the Rama restaurant, they found the counting room with its tables and money counting machines. The amount of physical proof taken was enormous. Agents collected hundreds of thousands of papers, money records, account books, phone bills, address books. They took computers and business records. They collected cash, millions of dollars in different amounts, found hidden in offices, cars, and homes. They took weapons. Though fewer than expected, the organization relied more on secrecy than on firepower. Perhaps most dramatically, agents took heroin itself at several places. They found stashes of the drug, kilograms of white powder that would test at very high purity. The amounts were smaller than investigators had hoped. The organization was good at not keeping large amounts in any one place. But there was enough to show that drug trafficking charges were not just theoretical. News of the arrests spread quickly through the Italian-American communities where many of the defendants lived. For some, it was a shock. Salvatore Catalano was known as a quiet bakery owner, not a drug kingpin. How could this be? For others, especially those connected to organized crime, the arrests were less surprising, but still concerning. If the FBI had gotten into the Sicilian network this deeply, what else did they know? Who else might be arrested? The arrest made headlines in newspapers across the country. FBI breaks major heroin ring, said the New York Times. Pizza parlors fronted drug empire. Read another headline, the media seized on the pizza angle. It made for a compelling story. The idea that ordinary pizzerias had hidden such extraordinary crimes. The case was quickly called the Pizza Connection in press reports, and the name stuck. But while the American operations had been disrupted, key people remained free. Gaetano Badalamenti was still in Brazil. Other Sicilian bosses remained in Sicily or elsewhere in Europe. For the investigation to be truly complete, these men needed to be brought to justice. Well, Gaetano Badalamenti had been living in Brazil since running from Sicily in the late 1970s. He kept a relatively low profile, but he also did not live as a runaway hiding in shadows. He had a comfortable apartment. He moved about freely. He kept planning parts of the heroin operation through phone calls and occasional meetings with trusted go-betweens. Badalamenti learned of the arrests in America. He knew his situation had changed dramatically. The FBI would certainly seek his sending to the U.S. The question was whether the Brazilian authorities would work together. Brazil had a complicated relationship with sending requests, especially in cases where the death penalty might be involved or where political thoughts came into play. Badalamenti's lawyers began preparing to fight sending, should it come to that. Meanwhile, the FBI and U.S. Department of Justice began the diplomatic process of asking for Brazil's working together. This involved working through the State Department, presenting proof of Badalamenti's crimes, and making the legal case for sending under existing agreements. The process was slow and frustrating. Brazilian authorities were willing to say that Badalamenti was in the country, but were careful about simply handing him over. They wanted to look at the proof, make sure the request met Brazilian legal standards, and think about the political meanings. The United States had to be patient and work through proper ways behind the scenes. The FBI also worked with Spanish authorities, as Badalamenti had connections and property in Spain and had been known to travel there. If Brazil proved unwilling to work together, perhaps Badalamenti could be arrested during a trip to Spain, where sending might be easier. The breakthrough came in 1984 when Badalamenti made a mistake. He traveled from Brazil to Spain, perhaps feeling that after months had passed since the American arrests, the heat had died down. Spanish police, told by the FBI, were watching. When Badalamenti arrived in Madrid, he was arrested. Unlike Brazil, Spain had a strong sending relationship with the United States and was willing to process the request relatively quickly. Badalamenti fought sending from Spain, but the legal ground was more difficult for him there. In early 1985, after months of legal proceedings, Spanish authorities okayed sending. Badalamenti was put on a plane to the United States, accompanied by federal agents. When the plane landed at a military base near New York, he was immediately taken into custody and moved to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, where he would wait for trial. His arrest was a major victory for the investigation. Badalamenti was the highest-ranking mafia figure arrested in connection with the Pizza Connection. His close presence in custody meant that lawyers could present the case not just as a series of individual crimes, but as an organized conspiracy led from the top. It also meant that some of the other defendants might think about working together. With Badalamenti arrested, there was less reason to keep omerta, with most of the major defendants in custody. Attention turned to getting ready for trial. Federal lawyers faced an enormous challenge. The pizza connection was perhaps the most complicated organized crime case ever brought in the United States. The proof involved wiretaps in many languages, money transactions across dozens of countries, and a conspiracy that lasted nearly 10 years. The lead lawyer was Louis Freeh, an assistant U.S. lawyer who would later become director of the FBI. Freeh and his team spent months organizing the proof, preparing witness lists, and making their strategy for trial. They had to decide which charges to emphasize, which witnesses to call, and how to present the mountain of proof in a way that a jury could understand. One early decision was to proceed under the RICO law. RICO allowed lawyers to charge the defendants as members of a criminal business and to hold them together responsible for crimes committed in furtherance of that business. This meant that even defendants who had not personally handled drugs or money could be convicted if lawyers could prove they were part of the conspiracy. RICO also allowed lawyers to introduce proof of the whole operation, not just specific criminal acts. They could show the jury how the organization was structured, how it worked, how it made decisions. This was critical because much of the defendant's involvement was in planning and coordination rather than in physically handling illegal goods. The defense lawyers, and there were many, as most defendants hired their own lawyers, challenged different parts of the lawyer's case in pretrial motions. They argued that wiretap proof should be left out because the warrants were overly broad. They argued that translations of the Sicilian dialect conversations were unreliable. They argued that their clients should be tried separately rather than in one huge trial, saying that joint trial would prejudice the jury against individual defendants. Judge Pierre Laval, who was assigned to the case, ruled on these motions carefully. He allowed most of the wiretap proof, finding that the warrants had been properly gotten and the interceptions legally done. He allowed the translations while letting defense experts challenge their accuracy. And he ruled that the defendants would be tried together. The conspiracy was joint, and the trial should show that as the trial date came near, some defendants began thinking about their options. A few lower-level members agreed to plead guilty and work with lawyers in exchange for reduced sentences. These working witnesses would prove crucial at trial, giving insider statements about how the organization worked. But most of the major defendants, including Catalano and Badalamenti, refused to work together. They said they were not guilty and got ready to fight the charges for men who had lived by the code of omerta their whole lives. Working with lawyers was unthinkable, no matter the possible sentence they faced. The trial was scheduled to begin in February 1985. It would take place in the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan in a courtroom that had been specially secured for the proceedings, given the nature of the defendants and the organizations they represented. Security was a major concern. Threats had been made against lawyers, witnesses, and even jurors. The trial would be done under new security measures. On September 30th, 1985, the trial of United States v. Badalamenti began. The courtroom was packed with defendants, defense lawyers, FBI agents, court people, and a small number of approved watchers and journalists. Security was tight. Everyone entering the courtroom passed through metal detectors and was checked by U.S. Marshals. The jury had been picked after extensive questioning of possible jurors to make sure they could be fair and not biased. The process had taken weeks as lawyers and defense lawyers questioned possible jurors for bias and for any connections to organized crime. Final jury was ethnically mixed and included several Italian Americans, which lawyers welcomed. They wanted to make clear this case was not about Italian Americans generally, but about specific criminals. Judge Pierre Laval explained to the jury that this would be a long trial. He guessed it might last 6 months, though in reality it would last far longer. He explained the charges and the burden of proof. The government had to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The defendants were thought not guilty until proven otherwise. Lawyer Louis Free rose to give the government's opening statement. He began by thanking the jury for their service and seeing the sacrifice they would make in sitting through this lengthy trial. Then he began to lay out the case. "This case is about heroin," Free said simply. "It's about a network of men who conspired to bring into the United States hundreds of kilograms of heroin, one of the most addictive and destructive substances known to humanity. It's about the profits from that heroin, hundreds of millions of dollars, and how that money was cleaned through international money institutions to hide its criminal origin." Free explained that the proof would show how the conspiracy worked, how heroin was made in Sicily, smuggled to the United States, distributed through networks centered around pizzerias, and how the profits were counted in back rooms and moved to Switzerland. He told the jury they would hear wiretapped phone calls of the defendants discussing drug shipments in code. They would see money records writing down the movement of money. They would hear statements from witnesses who had been part of the conspiracy and had decided to work with the government. The opening statement lasted several hours. Free methodically laid out the structure of the conspiracy, introducing the jury to the key players and their jobs. He explained how investigators had found the operation through years of watching and wiretaps, and he promised that by the end of the trial, the proof would be beyond any doubt that the defendants were guilty of the charges against them. The defense lawyers then had their turn, with nearly 20 defendants. There were nearly 20 defense lawyers, each representing their clients' interests. They could not agree on a joint defense strategy. Each defendant had different priorities and different theories of defense. Some lawyers attacked the believability of the investigation itself, arguing that the wiretaps were illegal invasions of privacy and that the FBI had overreached. Others focused on the supposed unreliability of the Sicilian dialect translations, arguing that innocent conversations had been misunderstood as criminal conspiracies. Still others argued that their clients were legal businessmen who had been caught up in something they did not understand. Even Fisher, representing Salvatore Catalano, argued that his client was simply a hard-working immigrant who ran a bakery. The government would present phone calls and meetings, but these were just business discussions. The code words the government claimed referred to drugs actually referred to legal business goods. The lawyers were building a conspiracy theory from innocent activities. Michael Kennedy, representing Gaetano Badalamenti, took a different approach. He said that Badalamenti was a mafia figure in Sicily, but argued that the government had no proof he was involved in drug trafficking to America. Badalamenti's phone calls to the United States were about other business matters. His presence in the case was based on guilt by association, not on actual proof of his involvement in the heroin conspiracy. The opening statements took several days to complete. When they were finished, the jury had heard radically different understandings of the same events. The lawyers promised to show a sophisticated criminal conspiracy. The defense promised to show innocent people caught in police overreach. It would be up to the proof to decide which story would win. The lawyer's case took months to present. It was built on several types of proof: wiretapped phone calls, watching reports, money records, physical proof, and statements from working witnesses. The wiretap proof was the backbone of the case. Lawyers played hundreds of hours of recorded phone conversations for the jury. Each recording was accompanied by a written copy in English, translated from the original Sicilian dialect. The translator would be present to answer any questions about the accuracy of the translation. The phone calls were ordinary and damning at the same time. A typical call might go like this: "Hello, it's me. I need to talk to you about those shirts we discussed." "Yes, I remember. How many do you need?" 22. "The same quality as before. That will take a few days to arrange. I'll need to check with our friend overseas." "Understood. And the shoes? They're ready. We can bring them to the usual place, to an outsider." The conversation might seem innocent or at least not clear, but lawyers presented these calls in context, showing patterns of similar calls followed by scene meetings. followed by money transfers or drug movements. The pattern made the meaning clear. Expert witnesses stated about the code language, explaining to the jury how they had decided what the code words meant. They showed charts mapping out dozens of similar conversations, showing the regular use of terms like shirts and shoes. Money proof was equally important. Lawyers presented records of wire transfers from the United States to Switzerland, showing millions of dollars moving through numbered accounts. They presented records of cash deposits in Swiss banks with deposit dates that matched drug transactions written down in wiretaps. They brought in money experts who explained the money cleaning process to the jury, walking them through the steps of changing cash to wire transfers to legal-seeming investments. Watching proof showed the physical meetings that matched phone calls. FBI agents stated about watching Salvatore Catalano meet with Giuseppe Pino Ganci in a parking lot. Seeing them pass packages between cars, agents described following suspects to pizzerias, to warehouses, to private homes. Photographs showed these meetings happening. Physical proof included the heroin itself. Kilogram bricks of white powder taken during searches, shown for the jury to see. Also shown were drug tools found at different places, scales for weighing drugs, mixing agents for making the heroin weaker before street sale, packaging materials and money, literal suitcases full of cash, photographed as they had been found. But perhaps most powerful were the statements of working witnesses, former members of the conspiracy who had agreed to state in exchange for reduced sentences. These witnesses could explain from personal experience how the operation worked. One working witness described working in the counting room at the Rama restaurant. He stated about sorting and counting cash late into the night, about the extraordinary amounts of money that flowed through that room, about the armed guards who watched as the counting went on. He described how bundles of cash would be got ready to be moved to Switzerland, vacuum sealed to reduce their bulk, packed into suitcases. Another worker described his job as a courier, traveling from Europe to the United States. Carrying heroin, he explained how the drugs were hidden, sometimes in specially made clothes, sometimes in false bottom suitcases. He described the terror of going through customs, knowing that if the drugs were found, he would spend decades in prison. And he described delivering the heroin to pizzerias in Queens and Brooklyn, handing packages to men he had never met before and would never see again. A third worker had been a mid-level dealer. He stated about getting heroin from the Sicilian suppliers, mixing it to increase the amount and distributing it to street-level dealers. He described the profits, how a kilogram bought for $100,000 could make $300,000 or $400,000 after mixing and retail sale. He stated about paying the Sicilian suppliers, always in cash, always counted carefully to make sure the amount was exact. These witnesses were cross-examined ruthlessly by defense lawyers. Their believability was attacked. They were criminals. They were stating to avoid long prison sentences. They had every reason to lie or exaggerate. Defense lawyers pointed out inconsistencies in their statements, times when they had lied to investigators before agreeing to work together, crimes they had committed that the jury had not heard about. But the working witnesses were only part of the proof, even without them. The wiretaps and money records told a compelling story. The workers simply gave color and context to proof that was already strong. After months of lawyer statements, the defense had its turn. The defense faced a difficult challenge. The government's proof was extensive and detailed, but the defense had several strategies available first. Many defense lawyers chose not to put on proof at all. This is not unusual in criminal trials. The burden of proof is on the lawyers. The defense does not have to prove innocence, only raise reasonable doubt about guilt. Some defense lawyers thought that the government had not met its burden and that putting on defense proof might only give lawyers a chance to introduce proof to argue against it. But other defense lawyers did present proof mainly aimed at weakening the lawyer's case. They called their own translation experts. who argued against the accuracy of the government's translations of Sicilian dialect conversations. These experts argued that certain phrases had been mistranslated, that Sicilian dialect was so everyday and context-dependent that outsiders could not reliably interpret it. Defense lawyers also called character witnesses people who knew the defendants as neighbors, business partners, or family members. These witnesses stated that the defendants were honest, hard-working people who would never be involved in drug trafficking. They described the defendants' contributions to their communities, their involvement in church and civic groups, their reputations as legal businessmen. Some defendants stated in their own defense, though this was risky. Stating exposed them to cross-examination by lawyers who could ask about previous statements, about seeming contradictions in their stories, about the specifics of the wiretapped conversations, but some defendants felt they had no choice. They wanted to look the jury in the eye and deny the charges. Salvatore Catalano took the stand. He stated that he had moved to America seeking a better life. He described building his bakery business through hard work and long hours. He said he knew some of the other defendants. They were from the same towns in Sicily. It was natural that they would socialize, but he denied any involvement in drug trafficking. When lawyers played wiretapped conversations for him, Catalano gave innocent explanations. Shirts referred to actual shirts. He was involved in a clothing import business on the side. Shoes meant shoes. The conversations were about legal business dealings, not drugs or money cleaning. Lawyers pressed him on the specifics, pointing out that there was no proof of any clothing import business, no records of shirt purchases or sales. Catalano became evasive, claiming he did not keep detailed records, that many transactions were in cash, that he did not remember every detail from years ago. Under cross-examination, Catalano struggled. Lawyers confronted him with money records, showing he had put in far more money than his bakery business could possibly make. They showed him records of calls to known drug traffickers in Sicily. They played wiretaps where he seemed to be coordinating drug shipments. Catalano's explanations became less believable as the cross-examination continued. Gaetano Badalamenti also stated, at 62 years old, he cut an impressive figure, still commanding despite years in hiding and now imprisonment. He spoke through an interpreter as his English was limited. He said he was a member of the Sicilian Mafia. There was no point denying it given his history, but he denied involvement in drug trafficking to America. Badalamenti stated that the Mafia in Sicily had many business interests, most of them illegal, but that he personally had always avoided drug trafficking. He had been kicked out of the Mafia Commission in part because he opposed the drug trade. He claimed the phone calls the government presented as proof of drug conspiracy were about other matters: construction projects, legal business deals, personal matters. Lawyers tore into this statement. They showed that Badalamenti had received millions of dollars from sources connected to the pizza connection. They showed phone records proving he was in constant contact with the American operation. They presented statements from Italian witnesses who said that Badalamenti was deeply involved in heroin trafficking. Badalamenti's denials became harder to believe as the proof piled up, beyond the main defendants. The trial featured statements that showed the human cost of the heroin trade. While the trial focused on the conspirators, occasional statements reminded the jury of the victims, the people whose lives were destroyed by heroin addiction. One witness was a former addict who described his fall into addiction after being introduced to heroin by a friend. He described how heroin had consumed his life, how he lost his job, his family, his home, all in pursuit of the next high. He described the desperation of addiction, stealing from loved ones, committing crimes to fund his habit. He described overdosing twice, being brought back by emergency medical people, and yet still returning to heroin because the addiction was so powerful. He stated that the heroin he bought on the streets of New York had almost certainly come through operations like the Pizza Connection. High-quality white heroin was what dealers sought because it was more potent and created more dependable addiction. While this statement did not directly prove any defendant's guilt, it reminded the jury why drug trafficking was taken to court so aggressively. This was not a victimless crime. Medical experts stated about heroin's effects on the body and brain. They explained how heroin creates physical dependence, how withdrawal is agonizing, how addiction changes brain chemistry in ways that make quitting extraordinarily difficult, even when the user desperately wants to stop. They presented statistics on heroin-related deaths, on the number of addicts in New York during the time the Pizza Connection was working. Police witnesses described the outbreak they were fighting on the streets. Narcotics detectives stated about whole neighborhoods ruined by heroin, they described. Crime waves driven by addicts needing to fund their habits. They described families destroyed, children left without parents, communities hollowed out. This statement served a purpose beyond establishing the severity of the crime. Lawyers wanted the jury to understand that the men on trial were not merely businessmen making illegal profits. They were responsible for spreading a poison that destroyed lives on a huge scale. The billions of dollars in heroin the Pizza Connection brought in represented hundreds of thousands of individual addictions, thousands of overdose deaths, immeasurable suffering. The defense tried to counter this emotional statement by noting that their clients were charged with trafficking, not with causing specific deaths. Each defendant was responsible only for his own actions, not for the actions of every heroin dealer and every addicted person in America. But the statement's impact was significant. The jury could see the human cost of the conspiracy as the trial entered its 6th month, then its 9th month, and passed the 1-year mark. It became clear this would be one of the longest criminal trials in American history. The complexity of the case, the number of defendants and witnesses, the amount of proof, all of it needed extraordinary amounts of time to present and examine. For the jurors, the trial was an enormous burden. Most had jobs and families. Sitting in a courtroom day after day for over a year meant missing work, missing important family events, putting their lives on hold. Judge Leval tried to make it as bearable as possible, keeping courtroom hours reasonable, giving frequent breaks, making sure jurors were comfortable. But it was still a tremendous sacrifice. The length of the trial also created legal challenges. Defense lawyers argued that such a lengthy trial violated their client's right to a quick trial. They argued that jurors could not possibly remember proof presented months earlier. They moved for mistrial many times. Judge Leval denied these motions, ruling that while the trial was indeed long, it was necessarily so given the complexity of the case and that the defendant's rights were being protected. Language remained a constant challenge. Many defendants spoke little or no English. Everything had to be translated into Italian or Sicilian dialect for them to understand. This slowed proceedings considerably. Sometimes statement would have to be repeated or made clear because of translation issues. Defense lawyers argued that their clients could not adequately help in their own defense because they did not understand the proceedings fully. Lawyers argued that the court was providing the best translation possible and that the defendants were getting a fair trial. Security worries continued through the trial. There were rumors of threats against witnesses, lawyers, and even jurors. Extra U.S. Marshals were assigned to the courthouse. Witnesses who had worked together were kept in protective custody. Some stated from behind screens to protect their identities. Jurors were escorted to and from the courthouse and were warned not to discuss the case with anyone or to go to places where they might meet defendants' helpers. The trial was also a media sensation. Reporters filled the limited public seating in the courtroom, and stories about the trial appeared regularly in newspapers and on television news. The Pizza Connection became a cultural touchstone. People discussed it at dinner parties. Comedians joked about it. It inspired movies and books. The defendants became celebrities in a strange way. Their photographs appearing in newspapers, their lives looked at in magazine features. This publicity created its own problems, Judge Leval repeatedly warned jurors not to read news coverage of the trial or to watch television news reports. He worried that outside information might prejudice them. But making sure of this was difficult. How could he know what jurors were reading at home? Finally, after 17 months of statements, the proof part of the trial ended. It was time for closing arguments. Each side's final chance to address the jury and argue why their view of the proof should win. The lawyers went first. Louis Free stood before the jury and summarized the case. He reminded them of the wiretapped conversations they had heard, the money records they had seen, the statements of working witnesses. He walked them through the structure of the conspiracy, showing how each defendant fit into the overall organization. The proof has shown beyond any reasonable doubt that these men conspired to bring heroin into the United States. Free argued, "You've heard them on tape discussing drug shipments. You've seen the money they made. You've heard from people who worked with them. This is not a case built on suspicion or guess. This is a case built on hard proof, their own words captured on tape." Discussing their crimes, Free addressed the defense arguments point by point. The code language was not unclear. The pattern of use made the meaning clear. The translations were not unreliable. Multiple translators had confirmed them. The working witnesses were not lying. Their statements were backed up by independent proof. He reminded the jury of the size of the operation. $1.6 billion worth of heroin. That's not a small-time operation, he said. That's not a misunderstanding or innocent business dealings. That's an enormous criminal conspiracy that flooded American streets with poison. The defense closings took even longer. As each defendant's lawyer addressed the jury, they attacked the government's case from every angle. Some argued that their clients were not part of any conspiracy. Others argued that even if a conspiracy existed, their clients were not knowing members. Still others argued that the government had failed to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt as to specific counts. Even Fisher, representing Catalano, argued passionately that his client was being taken to court for being Sicilian, for associating with other Sicilians, for speaking in dialect. The government wants you to believe that every time Sicilian immigrants talk on the phone, they're discussing drug deals, Fisher argued. But these are just men talking about their lives, their businesses, their families. The government has taken innocent conversations and twisted them into proof of crimes that never happened. Michael Kennedy, representing Badalamenti, saw the difficulty of his position, but argued that the government had relied too heavily on guilt by association. Yes, Gaetano Badalamenti was a mafia figure in Sicily, but being a mafia figure does not mean he was involved in this specific conspiracy. The government wants you to assume that because he knew some of the other defendants, he must be guilty. But that's not proof. That's prejudice. The closing arguments took weeks. When they finally ended, Judge Leval gave the jury their instructions, explaining the law they would need to use, the burden of proof, the process of discussion. And then in March 1987, more than 2 years after the trial began, the jury left to discuss. The jury discussed for 6 days. In the jury room, the 12 people who had sat through 17 months of statements now had to make sense of it all. They had books of proof to look at again, hundreds of pages of written copies to reread, countless exhibits to re-examine. The discussions were reportedly contentious. Some jurors were quickly convinced of the defendant's guilt. Others were more doubtful, wondering if the government had really proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. They looked at the wiretap proof again. They discussed the believability of the working witnesses. They debated the meaning of the code language. For the defendants, the waiting was agonizing. They remained in custody at the Metropolitan Correctional Center, waiting for word of their fate. Some showed confidence that they would be found not guilty. Surely the jury could not believe the government's case. Others were resigned to conviction. They had seen the proof and knew how damning it was. On March 2nd, 1987, word came that the jury had reached verdicts. The courtroom filled quickly. Defendants were brought from custody. Lawyers assembled. Lawyers took their places. Journalists and watchers filled every available seat. Judge Leval took the bench and brought the jury in. The process of reading the verdicts took hours. There were multiple counts for each defendant: conspiracy charges, real drug trafficking charges, money cleaning charges. The jury foreman read each verdict individually, defendant by defendant, count by count. Gaetano Badalamenti: guilty, guilty, guilty. Salvatore Catalano: guilty, guilty, guilty. Giuseppe Pinoganzi: guilty, guilty. Of the 22 defendants who went to verdict, some had pleaded guilty or had been separated from the trial. 18 were convicted on most or all counts, and 4 were found not guilty entirely. The verdicts were a complete victory for the lawyers. The jury had believed the government's case. They had found that the pizza connection existed, that it was a criminal conspiracy, and that the defendants were knowing members. Some defendants showed no reaction when the verdicts were read. They had expected this outcome. Others appeared shocked, as if they could not believe the jury had convicted them. Family members in the courtroom wept. The defendants were sent back to custody to wait for sentencing. Sentencing took place over several weeks. Each defendant had the chance to address the court before Judge Leval gave sentence. Some kept saying they were not guilty, insisting they had been wrongly convicted. Others expressed regret, though whether this regret was real or strategic was open to question. Judge Leval's sentences were severe, showing the seriousness of the crimes. Drug trafficking at this scale, he noted in his sentencing remarks, was not a case of poor people driven to crime by desperation. These were sophisticated criminals who had built an empire on addiction and suffering. They had earned hundreds of millions of dollars by flooding American communities with heroin. They deserved punishment that matched their crimes. Gaetano Badalamenti, as the conspiracy's mastermind, got the longest sentence: 45 years in federal prison, at 64 years old at sentencing. This was effectively a life sentence. He would die in prison in 2004 at the age of 80, having served 17 years of his sentence. Salvatore Catalano also got 45 years. Other major defendants got sentences ranging from 20 to 40 years. Even defendants who had played supporting jobs got big sentences: 10 or 15 years, in addition to prison sentences. Judge Leval ordered taking away of things. The government had followed millions of dollars to accounts and properties owned by the defendants. This money and property was taken away to the government, a recognition that criminals should not be allowed to profit from their crimes. The total taken away exceeded $200 million, though not all of it could be recovered, as some things had been hidden or transferred to others for the defendants. The sentences meant they would spend most or all of their remaining lives in federal prison. The American dream they had sought when moving from Sicily had ended in permanent imprisonment. Their families were destroyed. Wives became widows in all but name. Children grew up without fathers. Businesses failed or were sold. But lawyers and FBI agents who had worked on the case felt the sentences were just. These men had built a billion-dollar heroin empire. They had poisoned communities. They had caused immeasurable suffering. That they would now spend their lives in prison seemed right. The conviction of the Pizza Connection defendants had immediate and far-reaching effects on organized crime, both in the United States and in Sicily. The Sicilian Mafia's American heroin operations were badly disrupted. Key people were imprisoned. Networks were broken. The FBI had shown that even sophisticated, split criminal organizations could be gotten into and taken apart. The case also damaged the Sicilian Mafia's reputation for being unbeatable. For decades, the Mafia had worked with a sense that it was beyond the reach of police. Omerta would protect against informants. Dishonesty would protect against being taken to court. Distance and international borders would protect against investigation. The Pizza Connection proved all of these ideas wrong. Working witnesses had broken Omerta. No amount of threats could completely prevent people from stating when facing life in prison. International working together had overcome borders. The FBI had worked with Italian and Swiss authorities to build a complete case. and sophisticated investigative techniques, particularly wiretaps and money analysis, had gotten into the organization's security. Other mafia organizations took note. In the years following the Pizza Connection trial, there was a noticeable decrease in major heroin import operations by traditional mafia groups. The risk had become too high and the possible sentences too severe. Drug trafficking did not stop. Far from it, but it changed other organizations, especially from Colombia and Mexico, came to control the American drug trade in Sicily. The Pizza Connection trial happened at the same time as the Italian government's own aggressive anti-mafia campaign. The Maxi trial in Palermo, which took place around the same time as the Pizza Connection trial, convicted hundreds of mafia members. The combination of American and Italian court cases significantly weakened the Sicilian Mafia. But the Mafia changed as it always had. The organization became more careful about communications, more selective about who was brought into the inner circle. Drug trafficking continued, but at a smaller scale and using different methods. The days of the huge centralized operations like the Pizza Connection were over. But the Mafia itself survived for police. The Pizza Connection case was changing. It showed the effectiveness of several investigative techniques and legal tools that would become standard in organized crime investigations. Wiretaps proved their worth, despite the challenges of translation and code language. The wiretapped conversations provided the backbone of the lawyer's case. Future organized crime investigations would rely heavily on electronic watching, with improving technology making it even more effective. The RICO law proved to be the powerful tool lawyers had hoped it would be. By allowing the court case of whole criminal businesses rather than just individual crimes, RICO made it possible to hold criminal leaders responsible even when they never personally touched drugs or money. Nearly every major organized crime court case since the Pizza Connection has relied on RICO. International working together became a model for future investigations. The Pizza Connection showed that modern criminal organizations often work across borders, and effective police must do the same. The FBI's Legal Helper program grew significantly after the Pizza Connection, putting agents in countries around the world to help international investigations. Money investigations became central to organized crime court cases. The Pizza Connection showed that following the money could be as effective as following the drugs. The use of money records to prove money cleaning and to follow criminal profits became a standard investigative technique. Laws requiring reporting of large cash transactions were strengthened. Making it harder to clean money, the case also highlighted the importance of working witnesses. Despite the Mafia's culture of omerta, several members of the Pizza Connection had stated against their co-conspirators. This showed that with the right reasons, especially reduced sentences, even traditionally loyal criminals would work together. Lawyers became more aggressive in seeking workers, using the threat of long sentences under RICO to encourage working together. For the FBI specifically, the Pizza Connection was a watershed moment. The investigation involved hundreds of agents working for years on a single case. It needed resources, patience, and sophisticated coordination. The success proved right the FBI's approach to organized crime investigations and set examples for how similar cases would be handled in the future. The Pizza Connection entered American popular culture in ways that few criminal cases do. The name itself, catchy, memorable, slightly absurd, made it perfect for headlines and casual reference. People who knew nothing about the details of the case still knew the phrase Pizza Connection. The case inspired books, including Shana Alexander's complete account. Published in 1988, Alexander had covered the trial as a journalist and had special access to members. Her book gave a detailed insider's look at the investigation and trial. Ralph Blumenthal's Last Days of the Sicilians offered another view, focusing on the FBI's investigation and the larger context of Sicilian Mafia operations in America. Television documentaries explored the case, interviewing FBI agents who worked the investigation, lawyers who tried the case, and even some defendants' family members. These documentaries brought the story to wider audiences and cemented the pizza connection as one of the defining organized crime cases of the 20th century. The case influenced how Americans thought about Italian-American communities and businesses. For years afterward, jokes went around about checking whether your local pizzeria was really just a pizzeria. This stereotyping was unfortunate and unfair. The vast majority of Italian-American businesses were and are completely legal. But the Pizza Connection's dramatic story had captured public imagination in ways that made it a cultural reference point. In law schools, the Pizza Connection trial became a case study in complicated court cases. Law professors used it to teach about RICO, about managing trials with multiple defendants, about international proof gathering, about the challenges of translation and code language. Generations of law students studied Judge Laval's rulings and learned from the strategies lawyers and defense lawyers used. The case also influenced how journalists covered organized crime. The Pizza Connection showed that mob stories were not just about violence and colorful characters, but also about complicated money schemes and international operations. This encouraged more sophisticated organized crime reporting, focusing on the business side of criminal businesses. Decades have passed since the Pizza Connection trial ended. What happened to the people involved? Gaetano Badalamenti died in federal prison in 2004. Having served 17 years of his 45-year sentence, he was 80 years old. Reports from prison suggested he remained defiant to the end, never admitting guilt, never expressing regret for his crimes. Salvatore Catalano is still in federal prison as of this writing, now in his 80s. He has kept saying he is not guilty all through his time in prison. He will likely die in prison. His release date, assuming he lives long enough, would be in his 90s. Giuseppe Pino Ganci died in prison in 2009. Other defendants have died or been released after serving their sentences, though many got sentences long enough that they spent decades in prison. Those who have been released have largely disappeared into being unknown. Avoiding public attention, some of the working witnesses entered the Witness Protection Program, getting new identities and relocation help. Their whereabouts are unknown and protected. Others served reduced sentences and were eventually released, trying to rebuild their lives away from organized crime. The FBI agents who worked the case went on to distinguished careers. Carmen Russo retired from the FBI and later worked in private security. Other agents became supervisors, training new generations of investigators in the techniques that had proven successful in the Pizza Connection case. Louis Freeh, the lead lawyer, went on to become a federal judge and later director of the FBI from 1993 to 2001. His experience with the Pizza Connection undoubtedly shaped his approach to police and his priorities as FBI director. Judge Pierre Leval kept serving on the federal bench. He is widely respected for his handling of the Pizza Connection trial, which many consider a masterclass in managing complicated court cases. The pizzerias that served as fronts for the operation had mixed fates. Some closed immediately after their owners were arrested. Others were sold and kept working under new ownership. The new owners eager to distance themselves from the Pizza Connection legacy. A few still exist today, though with no connection to their criminal past. The case's legacy continues to influence police. The technique started in the Pizza Connection investigation. Extensive wiretaps, international working together, RICO court cases, money analysis, remain central to organized crime investigations today. The FBI's organized crime units still study the case as an example of how to build and take to court a complicated conspiracy case. Looking back on the pizza connection from the view of decades later, several lessons appear about organized crime, police, and American society. First, the case showed that no criminal organization, no matter how sophisticated or secretive, is safe from determined investigation. The Sicilian Mafia had worked for over a century, protected by omerta and dishonesty, but patient. Methodical investigation could get into even the most closed criminal society. Second, the case showed the importance of international working together in fighting crime across borders. The pizza connection could only be fully understood and taken to court by working across borders. In an increasingly globalized world, this lesson has become even more relevant. Modern criminal organizations work internationally, and police must do the same. Third, the case showed how legal businesses can be corrupted and used as fronts for criminal activity. The pizzerias themselves were legal businesses that served real customers, but they also gave perfect cover for drug trafficking and money cleaning. This highlights the need for watchfulness and for understanding how criminal organizations take advantage of legal business. Fourth, the case showed the human cost of drug trafficking. Behind the billions of dollars and the complicated conspiracy were hundreds of thousands of people whose lives were destroyed by heroin addiction. The pizza connection was not a victimless crime. It was a crime with victims too numerous to count fifth. The case showed both the power and limits of criminal justice. The court case was successful. The major defendants were convicted and imprisoned. But did this end drug trafficking? No. Other organizations filled the empty space left by the pizza connection. The basic problem of drug demand and supply continued. This suggests that while criminal court case is necessary, it is not enough to solve the broader problem of drug abuse in society. Finally, the case showed the adaptability of criminal organizations. The Sicilian Mafia survived the pizza connection court cases, though in weakened form. Criminal businesses learn from police successes and change their methods. This creates an ongoing cat-and-mouse game, with each side learning from the other's tactics. The pizza connection remains one of the most interesting criminal cases in American history. It had elements of international intrigue, sophisticated criminality, dramatic courtroom confrontation, and ultimate justice. It involved billions of dollars, multiple countries, and a cast of characters that could fill a dozen novels. But beyond the drama and the details, the case raises lasting questions about crime, punishment, and society. How do we balance the need for effective police with protection of civil liberties? The wiretaps that broke the pizza connection were legal, but they represented extensive government watching. Where is the line between necessary investigation and too much intrusion? How do we address the root causes of drug trafficking? The pizza connection existed because there was demand for heroin in America. Taking to court the suppliers did not eliminate the demand. Decades after the pizza connection trial, America still struggles with drug addiction and trafficking. What does this tell us about the limits of police approaches to drug problems? How do we think about immigration and ethnic communities in light of cases like the pizza connection? The vast majority of Sicilian immigrants were and are law-abiding people seeking better lives. But a small minority used ethnic networks to help crime. How do we keep security without engaging in unfair stereotyping? These questions do not have easy answers, but the pizza connection forces us to grapple with them. It's a case that shows something essential about human nature: the capacity for both great evil and great dedication to justice. For the FBI agents who spent years investigating the case, for the lawyers who spent months presenting it, for the jurors who spent over a year discussing it, the pizza connection represented their effort to hold criminals responsible and to make society safer. They succeeded in their immediate goal. The defendants were convicted and imprisoned. But the larger fight against organized crime and drug trafficking continues. New criminal organizations appear. New methods of trafficking are developed. New challenges arise for police. The pizza connection is history. but the problems it represented remain contemporary. As we end this journey through the pizza connection, from the sunny hills of Sicily to the pizzerias of Queens, from the counting rooms where millions were handled to the courtroom where justice was given, we are left with a complicated legacy. It's a story of American police at its best, patiently building a case and seeing it through to conviction. It's a story of organized crime's boldness and its ultimate weakness. It's a story of immigrants and communities, of legal business corrupted for criminal purposes, of billions of dollars and thousands of lives. And it's a reminder that behind every pizza parlor, every small business, every quiet neighborhood, there might be hidden stories of extraordinary complexity, stories of crime and punishment, of ambition and downfall, of the eternal struggle between those who would break the law for profit and those who would enforce it for justice. The pizza connection is over. The defendants are dead or imprisoned. The pizzerias have closed or been sold, but the story continues. A statement to one of the most remarkable criminal conspiracies and criminal investigations in American history. It reminds us that the fight for justice is never truly finished, that watchfulness is always necessary, and that sometimes the most extraordinary crimes are hidden in the most ordinary places. In the end, the pizza connection was about more than heroin and money. It was about the collision between two worlds, the ancient world of Sicilian organized crime and the modern world of American police. It was about men who thought they could build an empire on secrecy and threats, and about investigators who proved that no secret is forever, no conspiracy impossible to get into. The smell of pizza might never quite be the same for those who lived through that time, who read the headlines and followed the trial. Behind that familiar smell, they will always remember, was hidden one of the greatest criminal businesses in history, and one of justice's greatest victories in bringing it down. And so we close this chapter of American crime history. This story of the pizza connection, a tale of billions in heroin, of brave investigators and cruel criminals, of a trial that lasted 17 months and changed American police forever. If you have made it through this whole journey, you have traveled from Sicily to Switzerland, from Brazilian hiding to American courtrooms, through the whole arc of a criminal conspiracy that was as ambitious as it was ultimately doomed. The pizza connection is history, but its echoes remain, reminding us that the pursuit of justice, however long and difficult, is always worth the effort. The men who built the pizza connection believed they were beyond reach, beyond consequences, beyond justice. They were wrong. And in their downfall, they left us with a story that will be told for generations. The story of how pizza parlors became the front for a billion-dollar empire, and how that empire was brought crashing down by determined investigators who refused to give up. If you made it all the way to the end, or if this helped you fall asleep peacefully, let me know in the comments what part of this story surprised you the most. Should I cover more mafia stories like this? You just listen to the real Gangster Nights. Copies come and go, but the original never sleeps. Subscribe so the fakes cannot steal your tomorrow. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Like this video if you enjoyed it, and share it with anyone who loves deep dive true crime content. Thank you for watching, and until next time, sleep well and stay curious about the hidden stories of history.